P. Nordling. I'm the chair of this session today. I work at CSC IT Center for Science, and with me I have my colleague Liisa-Maria Maamankinen, acting as rapporteur. We also have a co-rapporteur, Elizabeth Newbold from UKRI SDFC, helping out with the note-taking as well. So this is just to show where you've landed. So as I said, this is the Synchronization Force Workshop 2024 and the third in line. So welcome to the actual session. This session today will focus on collaboration opportunities around PIDs. And we can stay both within the borders of European Open Science Cloud, but if there is a need to look beyond the EOSC, we can also consider what that could look like and whom to ideally involve. And as sustainability is the very cornerstone of persistent identifiers and also bases the very foundation for an interconnectivity of PIDs, we will also dedicate a little bit of time of discussing around that topic as well. Lastly, PID policies base the very foundation of the sustainability part. So we will also be discussing that somewhat and delve a bit deeper into what it might imply in this session today. Next slide, please. So the very goal of this workshop series is to produce a workshop report. This report will be published by December this year, but as this is the third in the line of three workshop series of the Synchronization Force, there will also be a white paper coming out of this, and this will be published by March next year. And this report will summarize all the great recommendations and all the conclusions that have come out of all of these workshops to date. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what we expect from you as participants of this workshop. So what we really like to see is to see some more details coming into the spreadsheet that we have opened up that include the 4 pre-asked questions that we've sent out in the survey. So you can keep populating that spreadsheet, but also we need help in bringing in the relevant findings from our discussions, both by inserting additional points to the note-taking document, but also for the concluding session taking place on the 7th of November. So that is, all help is greatly appreciated. And this is our program for today. We have 3 prominent discussion starters for today. So we have Tibor Kalman from GWDG discussing on the PID collaboration opportunities and sustainability of PIDs. We also have Wim Hugo from DANS presenting on the most recently published Fair Impact report on creating EOSC-compliant PID policies. I will give just a brief update of what the future of the EOSC PID policy could look like, or maybe just some indications based on the feedback that has come in so far on the PID policy. And lastly, we have Gabriela Mejias from DataSite, which will be presenting on the coordination mechanism for EOSC PID service providers. That is a proposal by the Fair Impact project. And then we will be giving the floor to every one of you to discuss and reflect on the discussion starters. We'll actually also provide some Q&As after each of these presentations, but yeah, we will also have some more time towards the end after the presentations. And then, of course, we will be discussing some more about the 4 pre-asked questions. Next slide, please. So some small details about this session before we move ahead. So this session is being recorded, but it's only going to be used for internal purposes to ensure that we are able to capture everything in the note-taking document. We will also be using the spreadsheet, as I mentioned, and the note-taking document to capture the discussions. And I would like to mention that it's good to be as specific as you only can be and make sure to include links as references to more information. Next slide, please. And a little bit more detail. So you have time until Thursday, 7th of November, which is the same day as the concluding workshop. So to populate the document and spreadsheet. So there is ample time, but of course, it's good to do this once we all have this freshly in our minds, what we are talking about. So preferably a bit earlier than that. And the next slide shows the four main questions that we will be discussing here today. So firstly, the one we usually always ask is what your project or initiative does to implement PIDs. The second question is around data/PID policies and the recommendations related to PIDs that you follow and the reasoning behind why this is a good guiding document for you or your initiative. The third question is about exit strategies, whether, if your PID service provider has one in place or is looking into developing one for ensuring sustainability. And the last question is about PID coordination mechanism and whether you think that there is a lack of that currently, and whether we would need to have some sort of a coordination in place to ensure coherence and sustainability of PIDs within EOSC. So those were the introductory slides. Now we have our first discussion starter, which is Tibor Kalman from GWDG. Please, the floor is yours, Tibor.
Thank you, Josephine. Welcome all at today morning's workshop session. Just a quick feedback that my audio is okay. Would be very valuable.
Yes, it is very good.
Thank you. Then next slide, please. So my part is about saying some word about the collaboration options, collaboration opportunities, and how it looks like in the context of sustainability of PIDs. To start that part, I would briefly summarize the journey we had in the EOS context during the last 2-3 years. Many of you might know already that there was a task force, a dedicated task force on PID policy and implementation around end of 21. This task force started its work. Then about a year later, the task force reorganized itself, setting new goals and focusing on dedicated topics. And the EOS Association decided to reconfigure all the task forces or all the task force landscape at the end of 2023, which meant for the PID-related activities and especially for the task force on PIDs that the mandate ended at the end of the last year. In the meantime, a new idea came up. This is the so-called opportunity areas, and this opportunity area concepts provides a much more flexible framework to discuss with experts on specific topics. One of the opportunity areas is dedicated for persistent identifiers. The work has been kicked off at the beginning of the year at the EOSC Winter School, and quite some things are not clear, at least not so clear like compared to the task force activities. Next slide, please, or click. Yeah, basically just to show the life cycle of the opportunity areas. And next slide, please. This brings me to the discussion what the sustainability of persistent identifiers might require. This require a bit more, and we have various options here when it comes to collaboration opportunities. I would like to speak a bit about two angles. One is the organizational point of view of these collaborations and sustainability aspects, and the other one is the more technological point of view. So let's start with the organizational point of view. Some of the other task forces which are currently running in the EOS context, have also goals around sustainability, around data management aspects, which might be relevant for PIDs. So if we think about PID policies, if we think about the sustainability of PIDs, these task forces should be somehow involved. Then I've already mentioned the opportunity area. This is a bit more unclear when it comes to focus. The governance of these opportunity areas and the real power of these opportunity areas are definitely less clear than it was, for example, for the task forces. But there is also something new, the nodes, the EOSC nodes, which are coming. This is, well, the very first node is going to be or going to go online in 3 weeks at the EOSC symposium. And it is also not entirely clear how policies, how discussions around persistent identifiers are handled on the nodes level, or how the Federation Handbook might be an instrument in this context. I also noted that it is expected that different kind of nodes, kind of ideas like having national nodes, then having e-infrastructure nodes, having thematic nodes, is foreseen in the broader EOSC Federation. So what does it mean for PID policies and how to collaborate on those levels? We expect to have national policies which influence also at least the national nodes, but also participating entities in other nodes. Also, the e-infras might have or have already had policies. And what we expect is that on the global level, at least the 4 existing global data initiatives have also say what should happen here. When it comes to the involved parties, then it is a challenge because this is a multi-layer issue for everybody. For example, a PID provider might be involved in different nodes, might be involved in different contexts, and if it is not done well, then it requires quite some extra resources. And then the involved parties might have options like saying goodbye, or the ones with additional resources might change their price tag on all these kind of activities. Next slide, please. Coming to the collaboration opportunities and policies and sustainability of persistent identifiers from the technological point of view. So on the more technology side, I have 3 examples here I would like to briefly introduce because these are different angles when it comes to today's discussion. The first example is one of the major PID technologies, the major software behind current persistent identifier infrastructures. The handle system has been there since 30 years. It has its own trust definitions, trust policy when it comes to who is involved in this infrastructure and whether I can trust in a service or not. This works perfectly in the PID world. It is a major a major well-defined architecture. The issue here is that nowadays many web-based services exist, and the trust in the web-based world is quite different. Probably you know this. If you open with your web browser a website, a web service which is not trusted, then a warning is coming. So how these different words handle trust is different. And most of the services, most of the current services which uses PIDs and try to maintain PIDs require quite some new features, namely somehow align the different words when it comes to trust. The involved parties are not necessarily interested in interoperability, but more focused on somehow interoperate their services. So this means that it is, from the technological point of view, there are new trends which should be addressed. Coming to the second example, verifying instruments, next slide, please, is about it is about how schema customization is done for communities when it comes to metadata inside the persistent identifier records. And the most common workflow looks like it is depicted on the figure. So first, quite some organizations, word data organizations, came to the conclusion that using clear type definitions for all data management related processes are great. These type definitions are machine actionable definitions, which can also be used for schema generation and validation. So machines are happy. And communities, in this concrete example, coming from the Verkauf for EOSC project, communities can now define and maintain their own metadata schemas directly in a so-called type registry, which is a service provided and sustained by the Persistent Identifier Consortium. Then these definitions gets a unique PID and can be referenced by these PIDs. In this concrete example, we did this for the definition of the PID-INST schema, which is a schema for describing scientific instruments. And building on the default PID-INST schema, our service, the B2INST service, the PID service for instruments, is able to include additional information for the instruments of a particular community. So that way we were able to verify information on instruments. And the challenge here is in this complex workflow, who defines what and who is responsible for which policy, because different PID actors need to interoperate with each other. And for some parts of this workflow, it's clear. It can be the Research Data Alliance or work groups inside the Research Data Alliance, which are responsible for the PID instrument schema, or when it comes to type registries and that kind of definitions, then the FDO forum might be responsible. When it comes to PID policies, which are used as kind of PID records, then in this concrete example, the Persistent Identifier Consortium is the one, but EOSC is somehow missing from this workflow and from the landscape. So how to use the persistent identifiers which refer to a particular resource type. So in this example, the instrument PIDs in the research workflows. We did this like, next slide, please. We did this like normal data sets. So basically, we just link everything together, and how to play this game, how to maintain the persistent identifiers of these different resource types, brings me to the third example, because currently different services are involved. So when it comes to datasets and datasets, PIDs, Epic or DataSite are the most common used service providers. Then instrument PIDs are handled in this example by the P2Inst bit provider, and person identifiers are managed by ORCID. These are all different services, which means in this case, they all use different technologies and they have different policies, which means basically different social contracts. And the example 3, next slide, please, is about how to deal with these kind of different services. Did we see in the EOSC context something similar, so similar issues and probably a solution for that? In the EOSC context, the PID meta resolver has been developed, and basically this is just a uniform interface that helps to resolve PIDs coming from different systems. And we see the challenge and the need for also for maintaining that kind of PIDs. Next slide, please. And this is basically my very last slide as a kind of an introduction to this topic. So if we managed somehow to upgrade probably the most important document in the EOSC PID policy context, the EOSC PID policy document, this is nice, but probably not enough. There are some other policy or policy-like documents or documents which have something to say about PID policies and PID sustainability. Mainly the PID architecture document, which is kind of discussed in the community. And just to recall, my main message here is so for me, the overall goal why I'm contributing to the workshop series of the Synchronization Force is not to sustain the problems, but when it comes to collaboration opportunities, when it comes some coordination among PID actors, then this should be seen in a multi-layered context. And with that, I think I stop here to save more time for the discussion.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Tibor. A lot of interesting points you brought forward in your presentation, but especially the uncertainty within the current EOSC is somewhat concerning, where the task force on PIDs was discontinued, and instead we have this opportunity area expert group on PIDs, which currently consists of project representatives, but which also do not have the same type of mandate as the task force had in terms of PIDs governance within EOSC. But this is something that is a work in progress, and the opportunity area tries to take a more prominent role by pointing to some issues that needs to be addressed quite urgently. For example, the updating process of the EOSC PID policy that has started. But I see a question in the chat from Maggie for you, Tibor. How are instruments different from, say, physical samples in the context of persistently identifying non-digital objects? Couldn't the same service architecture be used for both?
Thank you, Maggie, for the question. I believe the same service architecture can be used for both, and this is the main idea, to leave out from the architecture the whole information modeling discussion. The information modeling discussion should come or the results of the information modeling discussion should come from the community. And if there is an agreed, let's make it simple. When there is an agreed description, an agreed schema, how to describe physical samples or how to describe other resource types, then the service architecture can be used. And the instruments are just an example how the architecture would look like.
Mm-hmm. So Maggie, you please go ahead.
Yeah,
Continue.
just to clarify here. So I'm just thinking not so much from my wearing my research infrastructure hat here, but more from a researcher point of view. So there is a risk, I think, of fragmenting the landscape of services and having loads of different PID services that not only are divided because they are different themes. So I fully understand that we need one sample or several sample focused PID services. We need something for instruments. But my concern is with that there may be slightly different ways of interacting with them, slightly different APIs, slightly different cost models and all of these things. And that is just, I think, a hindrance to a more pervasive use of and consistent use of persistent identifiers for all resources that we or assets that we use in research. And I'm not so sure that the policy at the current state is really addressing those kinds of issues, but that's for another day. I just wanted to mention this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maggie. I fully agree with everything you said there. So this is a work in progress on many fronts. Any other questions for Tibor at this point? We also have some time after the presentations if you want your questions to mature a bit. If not, let's move forward. Next, we have Wim Hugo to present on creating EOSC compliant PID policies. Please go ahead, Wim.
Yeah, thanks, Josephine. So the first slide deals with our process to date and into the near future. So essentially, the work that we're talking about today is a close collaboration between FAIR Core for EOSC and FAIR Impact. FAIR Core for EOSC, of course, building infrastructure, a compliance assessment toolkit and platform for evaluating compliance against criteria using tests and benchmarks and metrics. And then FAIR Impact more focused on the guidance and best practices and characteristics and features of the, in this case, the PID services and how that relates to policy. So there's 4 broad steps. We started with the previous version of the EOSC PID policy, which we then formalized a little bit so that it could be encoded for compliance assessment. And we added 2 criteria in terms of persistence and resolvability, which to our mind was quite important if we're talking about persistent identifiers, to try and verify to what extent these very foundational features are being adhered to by different services. Those were published in 2 deliverables by FAIR Core for EOSC with the links available to you. And then we started looking at integrating guidance for these criteria, metrics, benchmarks, and tests. That's an ongoing process, but an interim publication is to some extent the focus of what we are discussing today, which has to do with guidelines for managers in respect of PID use and applications. And then our final output will be a knowledge base that contains a lot of work done in FAIR Impact, but integrated into the compliance assessment toolkit, so that in addition to assessment tasks, people can also evaluate, verify persistent identifier services, look for information about them, and also determine which PID services might be applicable to their own context. So that work needs to be done at the latest mid-year next year, but we aim to release a beta version of this knowledge base towards the end of this year already. Next slide, please. So in the CAT, we have developed a number of information models. I'm just showing two of them as an example. The one we're looking at here looks at the demand side for persistent identifier services, the use cases that are involved, the workflows, the benefits that people expect from using persistent identifiers, and then try to map them to the PID stacks, as we call them, which is essentially a collection of actors in the landscape that all need to do a proper job for us to be able to use a persistent identifier service. And of course, quite important is that not all persistent identifiers are applicable to all entities. There are specialized ones through kernel information profiles or custom metadata profiles that are very specifically designed for only one type of entity, whereas other PID providers cater basically for any kind of entity. So if we want to look a little bit more closely at the actors on the next slide, that is a second kind of information model developed in the CAT, then you can see that there's essentially a supply side and a demand side in the landscape or in the ecosystem. The users, the owners, and the managers of the persistent identifiers are essentially involved in demand for services, whereas the providers or registration agencies, the authorities, the schemes, the standard bodies, and so on, are involved in providing those services. And I think it's quite important to note that when we are developing a persistent identifier policy from an end user perspective, then you have to select the appropriate stack or stacks on the supply side, because you can't really control what happens there. You can only manage by way of selection. Whereas when it comes to your own actions as a manager or how you work with the owners of the persistent identifiers, of course, you have a lot more control. So the policy needs to take account of this sort of dichotomy in the ecosystem. The next slide, please. So Fair Impact published about 2 months ago or so, practices and guidelines for managers of PID services. Best practices, there are 16 of them identified to date. There are several more that we haven't published yet. And of course, there are other best practices and guidelines and recommendations applicable to other actors in the ecosystem that we have also documented, but has not been published yet in any way. But be it as it may, the demands for PID services and the kind of things to take account of as a manager are documented in this deliverable. I think it is still open for public comment until the end of October, or maybe it was until the end of September, but we've received some inputs that we will take into account prior to final publication. Next slide, please. So the sources of best practice then, it came from evaluating the EOSC PID policy, the work that we're doing in Fair Impact, and then quite a substantial piece of work done by Fair Impact to document the elements, characteristics, and attributes of PID stacks. And I'll show you an excerpt of that on the next slide. And included into that is this idea of the principles that apply to open open public infrastructure, such as persistent identifier services, and that deals quite extensively with aspects of sustainability, technical, social, and financial sustainability, as we have categorized them. So that forms an important part of the types of characteristics and attributes of PID services that one has to take into account. we match those elements and characteristics and attributes of the supply side with the workflows and the use cases and the benefits that the demand side expects of these PID services. And from that, we then derive 4 sets of best practices, recommendations, and guidelines. And the one that was published by Fair Impact deals with managers, but we also have sets of these for owners, for agencies and providers, and for the authorities. Now, initially, we only thought of using this knowledge base to provide information to the end user community and to provide institutional and national policy advice. But as I will point out a bit later, we are also now working on the creation of custom policies in the compliance assessment toolkit, because it was identified as quite an important requirement from the community through the Fair Impact engagements. So the intention then is to allow, for argument's sake, institutions, initiatives, infrastructures, national funding agencies, whoever, to use the EOSC PID policy as a basis for creation of a customized policy that they can then make applicable to their stakeholders and participants. Next slide. So these elements, characteristics, and attributes of PID stacks are grouped into 5 or 6 big categories to do with functionality, the service topology, the cost, performance, which includes things like governance and sustainability, mitigation, which largely deals with things like link rot and content drift and so on, and then also proper definition of how the PID service works, which schemes are involved, which authorities are involved, and so on. So there's a clickable link to a live version. It's not the latest one, but it gives you an idea of the depth of information that we are collecting to create a view on the elements and characteristics of PID stacks. Next slide. We then go and look at the criteria applicable to PID managers. In the EOSC PID policy, not all criteria apply to all actors, but there's about 15 or 16 or so that apply to managers. We're not going to be able to go into them in detail, but on this slide and on the next slide, you can get a sense of the scope of these criteria that are applicable to PID managers. And on the next slide, you will see that we've added 2 criteria that were not initially in the EOSC PID policy that determines the extent to which managers comply with the requirement for persistence and resolvability. So that's the scope of the criteria in the EOSC PID policy that applies to managers specifically. Next slide, please. So what we did then is to look at all these features and attributes and characteristics of persistent identifier stacks and services and the requirements of the user community. So at the bottom of this slide, there are little buttons there that says things like persistent and unique and resolvable. That maps to the mind map diagram of all the different characteristics and features that we expect from persistent identifier services. And then towards the top right, there are additional little polls that say C7, 14, 34, and so on. Those are links of this specific guidance or best practice to the criteria in the EOSC PID policy. So we've defined 16 guidelines or best practices to date, dealing with different aspects, of course, but the links between the criteria and the EOSC PID policy and the features that we expect from our services are integrated into the guidance. And we won't have time, of course, to look at these guidelines in detail today. We can quickly flip through them. It deals with selecting an appropriate persistent identifier depending on what you want in terms of persistence and uniqueness and resolvability. The next slide deals with guideline in terms of what's expected in managing persistence, which is largely a question of effort and not technology. The next slide deals with managing versions. And again, there's no single silver bullet here because it depends on your intentions. In some cases, you need to have an exact reference to something that will never change, down to the level of a checksum. In some cases, people always want the latest version and maybe links to older versions, but their main intention is to be able to find the latest version. And then, of course, there are variations and nuances there. Next slide, please. It's just about naming those versions using a established convention. Next slide. Deals with stakeholder involvement. You can skip to the next one. This is quite interesting for today's discussion because these are guidelines that are provided in a bit more detail in the document. The kind of things to look at in a service provider if you are a manager, whether they are certified and compliant with quality assurance frameworks, how they provide for continuity and sustainability, whether responsibilities of the different actors are properly defined, preferably in formal agreements, and then what kind of value-added services they might offer on top of the basic registration and resolution services. So those are sort of important considerations in selecting, amongst others, selecting a PID service provider. Next slide. You have to select appropriate scale. This is quite an interesting distinction because even if everything else was equal, sometimes the scale is such that only a few providers can give us a suitable service. So the scale at which you are going to mint these persistent identifiers to some extent determines the choices that you make. Next slide. Schema and structure. You want to be able to cover aspects such as uniqueness, how resolution works, and quite importantly, how difficult it might be to migrate a corpus of persistent identifiers in future, either from one provider to another or from one owner to another. So all of these use cases are also important when selecting an approach and maybe developing a policy. Next slide. The resolution options, whether it's machine usable and human usable. Next slide. How resolution works, and who is responsible for maintaining resolution integrity. So typically it takes more than one actor to guarantee resolution, and it's important to know who does what and how it works. Next slide. It's also important to understand where the authoritative metadata will reside and who looks after it. In some cases, this is with the kernel information kept by the provider or the registration agency. But in most cases, the authoritative metadata is probably with the manager of the metadata. Next slide, please. Then you also have to look at whether there are machine actionable extensions available to these metadata services. Next slide. You should also be monitoring resolution integrity. This is actually quite a complex problem to solve. It's reasonably straightforward. I'm saying that to have qualification already. Reasonably straightforward to monitor resolution to the point of the provider. but monitoring resolvability if the problem lies with a manager of the persistent identifier is not so straightforward. You need to develop a policy in respect of how you're going to work with sensitive metadata. There's an ongoing discussion about this in Fair Impact because I would say the simplest approach is to avoid sensitive metadata at all because it doesn't contribute to discoverability because it's not publicly visible in that case. But we are finding cases where there are sensitive metadata that's of interest to people that are the users of the data sets. And I think the best practice to some extent should be that all of the sensitive metadata ideally should only be in custom metadata and not in kernel metadata, but that's an open discussion at the moment.
I'm
3
sorry,
more to go.
Yeah, can we skip maybe to the last slide?
Yeah, we can
That one
skip to
is
the
really
last. Sorry,
interesting.
it's taking
All
a
of
bit
them
long.
are interesting, but we don't have that much time, I'm afraid.
Okay, so
Sorry
that's a
about
link
that.
to the deliverable for those that are interested. And then the final slide, just to reiterate that the CAT will soon support the additional use cases of cloning EOSC PID policies as a basis for institutional or funder or project infrastructure related policies, where people can then add specifics as criteria or tests and potentially refine or tighten the benchmarks that they want to use to evaluate against. Okay, and that's it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Wim. So it's really good that you shared this underlying structure with the PID stacks. Might be useful information when developing a PID policy of your own. So great that you share that. About the deliverable D3.3, the guidelines for creating a user-tailored EOSC-compliant PID policy, the original plan was for it to be open until the end of September. That was until yesterday, but technically it's still open. So feel free to provide your feedback on it still if you're being quick. So I think in the interest of time, we will take the questions a bit later. I just have a few slides before we take Gabby's viewpoint. So if you wouldn't mind sharing the slides again with the future of the PID policy, well, that might be a bit bold statement, but in any case, it's around the revised version of the EOSC PID policy, which is currently being worked on. And this is a task assigned to the opportunity area for PIDs. So in the forthcoming slides, I will present to you some of the feedback that most likely will result in some changes to the policy within the coming months. So firstly, there are some principles of the EOSC PID policy that aren't elaborated upon in the subsequent policy criteria definitions. So just to mention a few, these are PID services should be interoperable, technology independence of PIDs, and with the encouragement of new and innovative services and tools that, as I said, there aren't reflection upon these in the later parts of the PID policy, so that should probably be something to work around. The next slide, please. So about the PID applications, so for example, PIDs should ideally be supported by community ownership and public governance, which ensures in turn sustainable infrastructure and widespread adoption. And a more realistic means for accomplishing this, as opposed to engagement with the end user community merely, is through having a feedback mechanism in place for accomplishing this, and that'll allow more flexibility as well. And when it comes to versioning, in the current version of the PID policy, it's not specified what the object of versioning is. So in this case, the versioning aspect should concern both the kernel metadata as well as the object or the concept that the PID references to. Furthermore, the urgency of versioning should be changed from the current should to must, because it's that important. Next slide, please. So in the policy, it says that PID authorities and PID service providers must agree to be certified with a mutually agreed frequency in respect of policy compliance. So there has been some discussions that is, certification the way to go? Could it be called something else, review or revision or assessment or appraisal? But also the frequency of assessment should be defined. To be considered also what has been done, for example, within the core trust seal, where assessments are done every 3 years. And additionally, since the PID managers are the role that are the most or highly affected by the policy, there should also ideally be tailor-made consultation for managers. But as you heard just in the presentation from Wim, there is now a report available, including guidance for PID managers for creation of PID policies. The next and last slide that I had is on governance and sustainability. So the policy states that the governance structure should align or be embedded in global governance. So there is this discussions that there is a clear need to define what is meant by global governance in a practical sense, and how this should be validated in the first place. Also, furthermore, the EOSC governance is tasked with overlooking the implementation of the policy within EOSC, and there is also an urgency, as I said before, to decide whom constitutes the EOSC governance in this case. And in addition, there is a need to resolve the means of compliance assessments, the frequency of the assessments being made, as well as the issue of continuity. And the last point I want to make quickly, according to the policy, the review of the policy is to be managed by a dedicated group of experts. And the ownership of this should be made clear, as well as the actor for conducting the frequent reviews of some sort. But naturally, this should fall under the opportunity area 01 on PIDs. Thank you. That's all for me. And I think we can take the next presentation immediately, which is on coordination mechanism for EOSC PID service providers. And Gabriela Mejias from DataCite is here to present on that. So please go ahead, Gabriela.
Yes. Hi, everyone. And I think Sarah is managing the slides. I just wanted to quickly ask you to refresh because I just added some text. Sorry about the last minute change. And yeah, I'm Gabi Mejias and I work at DataCite as the community and program manager. And I will be speaking specifically about the work DataCite is leading in Fair Impact in the task 3.1 towards a coordination mechanism for PIDs across EOSC. To start with why Fair Impact is working with PIDs, because both PIDs and their metadata are crucial to achieve the FAIR principles. And what we aim to achieve is to support sustainable implementation of PIDs across EOSC, and to do so, this part of our impact, task 3.1, is focusing on the PID providers. Next slide, please. And this is an overview of the work package 3 dedicated to PIDs tasks. And as I said before, the task 3.1 is led by DataCite, and the main goal is to establish a coordination mechanism for EOSC PID providers. Next. And this is an overview of the milestones for this task, and I'm going to explain a little bit of this journey with you. But the last we've delivered the last milestone a couple of months ago, and the deliverable for this task is a shared long-term vision for PID providers in the EOSC context. Next, please. So the first step in this journey was a joint value proposition for PIDs, and this was delivered in 2022, so 2 years ago, the first year of the FAIR Impact project. And to do this, we've organized a hybrid session in co-location with the EOSC Symposium in Prague. And we invited PID providers to discuss about the issues PID can solve, the benefits, and that's how we came up with a joint value proposition of PIDs. And I'm not going to go through each one of the elements, but you can take a look at the deliverable. Next, please. And the second stop of the journey of this task is or was to propose a coordination mechanism for PID providers in EOSC. This was delivered actually last year. Back then, there was actually a coordination mechanism in place, which was the EOSC PID task force that Tibor mentioned. And so as part of this work, the idea was not to reinvent the wheel or to add additional governance layers for this topic, but rather what we proposed was to build on the work being done by the task force. And what we proposed there was for the EOSC PID task force to be that space where this coordination happens, especially also because the task force has the mandate of managing the EOSC PID policy. And on this document, we formulated that it was essential to have this bridge between the EOSC community and PID providers, to include emerging PIDs, also to ensure that the PID providers comply with the EOSC PID policy, and also as a space to share the needs from the EOSC community into the PID providers, and also to share discussions and outputs from EOSC-related projects that focus on PIDs. And you also have the link of the milestone report in the slide. Next, please. And the last step of our journey was to deliver aligned requirements to onboard PID providers into EOSC. We've delivered this earlier this year in May. And for this work, we've analyzed the requirements for the PID providers as per the EOSC PID policy. And we didn't do this on our own, but rather we built on the work done by Core for EOSC, the work led by Wim that he previously explained on his presentation. Basically, this means the criteria of the EOSC PID policy, and then the task did some prioritization of those criteria. And we've also continued the work done in the Freya project. They delivered a couple of years ago a survey landscape of PIDs, and gathered information about new PIDs especially in the EOSC context. So some of the new PIDs we've identified were RATE, the research activity identifier, the RAY ID, which is another PID being developed by the project RACE, but it's also a decentralized identifier, the SWIT or the software heritage ID, and some other identifiers. And important to mention that as part of this work, there's a lot of overlap between the EOSC PID policy and the POSI that also been mentioned, the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure, which is a set of criteria that some PID providers have already used to assess how they offer open infrastructure. Next, please. And there are some open questions and next steps, and Josephine mentioned already some of this. The first one is the place of PIDs in EOSC, given that there used to be a task force dedicated to this topic, and now that task force has been discontinued, there's this opportunity area that exists, but its role across the EOSC governance, and especially the scope, is still needs to be clarified. Another open question is the future of the EOSC PID policy. Now the opportunity area is discussing some changes based on a suggestion provided by the former EOSC PID task force, but overall the question is who governs the EOSC PID policy, who has that mandate within EOSC, especially because we were proposing the criteria in the policy as part of the requirements to be onboarded into EOSC. So this is a very important point. Another open question is around the future EOSC nodes, because in the past, PID providers and other service providers could be onboarded into the EOSC portal. Now that needs to be migrated into the EOSC node, and we are still, as Tibor said, the EOSC node will be launched in October in the EOSC symposium in Berlin. So we still have to see what would that look like. And overall, another question about this is that there's no contractual relation between EOSC and the PID providers, so that also makes the relation a little bit unclear. And as one of the next steps for our task would be to gather feedback from the EOSC PID providers around the topics we've been working in the task, like especially the coordination mechanism and the requirements. And we will also do this in coordination with for Core 4 EOSC, the work package 2 that FIM is leading. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Looking forward to your questions.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Gabi, for sharing with everyone the work of the Fair Impact Project in terms of the PID value proposition and the PID service provider coordination mechanism, and what those would ideally entail. Really interesting for everyone probably to hear about. Thank you to all the presentations, to all the presenters. Excuse me. so far. So now we have reached a point in time where we open the floor for discussions and comments to all of the presentations you've just heard. So do we have any questions so far? I at least couldn't see anything in the chat. So that is very fine as well. We can save some time also for discussing the 4 pre-asked questions that were included in the survey and that we would like to further elaborate upon with this group of people here today. So we had the questions were, what does your project or initiative do to implement PIDs? The second question, which data/PID policies and recommendations do you follow and why? Do you know if your PID service providers have a strategy in place or are developing one, exit strategy for ensuring sustainability? And lastly, how do you think the lack of PID coordination mechanism would impact the EOS community? So we are now happy to take any comments that you might have on this or sharing your input from your projects or initiatives on these questions. Yes, Paolo, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to shake a little the tree because I think, sorry, I joined later, but I was part of the PID task force and I'm part of many projects that you mentioned. So it's all clear why we would all benefit from having, let's say, a common way to collect information behind persistent identifiers. Okay, so that's clear enough. And also why it would be useful to have this collective effort in the sense that we could also change, for example, some of the ways PIDs are managed today. I'm part of OpenAir, so for example, on our point of view, it's crazy the effort that you have to do to move from one persistent identifier scheme to another persistent identifier scheme. We had to implement multiple APIs to do so. We are now experimenting in third course for EOSC with one entry point to many PID providers. And again, there are challenges there, but of course, this is the direction we want to take. But another important matter here is the fact that in many cases, PIDs are extremely important. Of course, we're not debating this, but in many cases, the availability of different PID schemes for the same entities creates problems, right? So, of course, we can point uniquely to objects, but we know the same object as different and obeys to different unique entry points. And different domains use different schemes. So when you try to bring in these domains, and this is the case for actions like the ones of OpenAir, so global aggregators of data, but also national ones have the same problems. It is a problem. So another level of coordination would actually be on how to maintain correspondences between persistent identifiers that belong to different schemes, but they refer to the same objects. And that's not fully agreed on as a model. I know Crossref and DataCite are doing similar things and they're trying to align on that, but it's an aspect that should be considered, regarded as part of the study.
Yes, thanks very much, Paolo, for bringing this to our attention. And that is a really good point which really highlights the very need of some sort of collaboration mechanism on PIDs as well. So that's a good point. So Alan, you want to say something on this topic, I guess? Please.
Yes, thank you. Just to one follow-up question, maybe to this what Paolo said. So is it idea EOSC to agree on some common PIDs for the same entities, as we said, like registry of organizations or something like that? And do you have some idea how to align this if we have let's say DOIs and some national PID services, so we have for the same digital object we have several like PIDs, and they are referenced all around. And also, for example, for the organizations, we have several PID services. So do we have the idea how to approach this in the EOSC? Are we going to agree on common PIDs or having some mechanism to align all of it? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Alan. I think Wim wants to reply on your questions. So please go ahead.
Yes, that's right. So the EOSC PID policy, of course, at the moment does not say anything about which persistent identifier is recommended or mandated for any specific entity. But many of the national policies that we have analyzed in the FAIR Impact project actually do so, and we include that information in the knowledge base. The problem, of course, is that it is somewhat problematic to choose a specific provider over another, because it essentially limits the business opportunity or viability of the other providers. So from a technical point of view, one wants as little diversity as possible. But I think from a social perspective, this is a much more complex problem to solve. What we have done is in the opportunity area, we're hoping to start providing requests to the provider community, or sending requests to the provider community, to at least harmonize the style of their API requests and the type of requests that they support, so that diversity has less of a technical impact. And I think that's maybe one starting point.
Thanks, Wim. Tibor, please go ahead.
Yeah, basically a follow-up or an extension what Wim was saying. I think in this context, it's also useful or less useful, I don't know, to define EOSC as such, because EOSC is not a legal term. EOSC is not an entity which could define any kind of policy or could give suggestions. The EOSC Association is the legal entity which drives the development of the EOSC as a federation. And the federation will contain nodes which, at least in my understanding, are going to be legal entities, which again are able to make that kind of policies. And from previous discussions, we learned in the task force that probably on the level of the tripartite collaboration, such recommendations, such policies could be made. What does it mean? On the tripartite level, the association is there, the EOSC Association is there, the Commission is there, and the member states are there. And these are the ones who somehow govern the EOSC Federation. And if they would agree on that kind of thing, then that could be a recommendation under the label of EOSC.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tibor, for the clarification. So yeah, indeed, the EOSC Federation Handbook will now also include a separate chapter, or at least currently it looks like it, with policies on, for example, rules of participation and access policies, etc. So I hope that this will also help clarifying in many ways how to deal with the sustainability of different outputs and project involvement in the EOSC landscape as a whole. And as was mentioned in the previous presentations, that the handbook will be discussed some more with during the EOSC symposium. So there will be a Q&A session where the floor is open for discussions and questions and suggestions on the handbook. So for that event, the handbook has not yet been closed for community review. So that is an ample opportunity for having a say on how that is supposed to look like. I saw another good or great point in the spreadsheet that I wanted to pick up on. It was an entry point made by Gabby and how they decide which type of documentation they are following in terms of data or PID policies. So there was mentioning of these principles of open science infrastructures, also known as POSI. I don't know if you've stumbled upon this document before, but it outlines some principles for different parts relevant for open scholarly infrastructure on governance, on sustainability, and on insurance. So that is something that is maybe worthwhile looking into if you're not familiar with those sets of principles as of yet. Thanks, Gabi. Yeah, she inserted into the chat also a direct link to the POSI principles. Do you, Gabi, want to elaborate on the POSI principles and how you concretely make use of those in DataCite?
Yes, so the POSI principles is basically a set of criteria for organizations offering research infrastructure services, and these are 3 criteria around governance, around sustainability, so financial sustainability, and also around technical insurance. So you can check on the website the criteria, and the interesting thing is that each organization that wanted to commit to these principles have done their own assessment on how the organization is fulfilling these criteria, and has publicly shared that assessment, as well as the commitment to comply with these criteria. And yeah, many organizations like Crossref, DataCite, also OpenAir, ROAR have already committed to this set of principles.
Thanks very much, Gabi. Wim.
Yeah, just to reiterate that the principles in POSI and those criteria have already been linked to the guidelines that Fair Impact published in deliverable 3.3. So where applicable, there is a link, and say if you do this, then by implication you are also aligning with that criterion in POSI.
Okay, thanks for letting us know about that. And I also saw that both DataCite and Crossref are working towards an exit strategy, also using the POSI principles there. So there are some links in the spreadsheet with some concrete descriptions of in terms of how this work is run there. Any other comments on these topics? Multiple ones on PIDs. Maggie, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring up on this issue of sort of this question, what the PID systems is your organization using, etc. That I think there is sometimes a little bit of a dichotomy and also confusion between what an organization is using. For instance, like the research infrastructure that I work for, ICOS, we are mainly using handle-based PIDs for our data. But at the same time, for our metadata structure, we are relying completely on linked data principles. So that we are using URIs, which we, of course, would like to think that the ICOs created ones are persistent. But of course, again, we were talking about exit strategies earlier. This is very important that such things are kept, because otherwise, of course, the moment an organization or entity that has been issuing PIDs or creating cool URIs or persistent URLs, for instance, ceases to exist, even if you manage to create a kind of static web resource that you expect to maybe survive in a couple of years timeline at least. The moment that disappears, then the whole house comes falling down in terms of the metadata description and especially pointing to contents of data sets. So one of the things that we hinted at in the ICOS response that is now in the spreadsheet is that we think that EOSC or some similar organization, maybe on a global, in the global context, should exist where you can place such orphaned sets of links and the definitions so that they may continue to persist, at least in a, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 year perspective. Having said that, though, I mean, in some research disciplines, people are now even starting to talk about not needing persistent identifiers that will live over a very long time, but actually more focusing on the short term. So I see a very broad landscape here, and something that I think we need to bring the end users into this as well, and really ask them, what is it that you guys want? What is important to you?
Thanks, Maggie. Very interesting points again that you brought forward. That is actually something that there will be a workshop around addressing findability across projects where Fair Impact, Fair Core for EOSC, and Open Web Search will be involved. And there the viewpoint will be the end user perspective. So I think that is really important that we, at this point in time, are continuously at least bring in the endpoint end user point of view into these discussions as well. Wim, please.
Yeah, so on this aspect of continued resolution and availability, we are starting to create services to monitor resolvability and persistence in Fair Core for EOSC. And the deeper we dig, the more interesting it becomes, of course. I would say a very large proportion of the persistent identifiers we currently use are based on the handle system. And technically, the handle system makes provision for recording when a persistent identifier was first registered and what it pointed to, but hardly anyone uses that. So for a start, at the current point in time, it's impossible to determine when a handle-based persistent identifier was first registered and for how long it's been available, and whether the thing it pointed to has changed over time. So we're digging into, using Memento, digging into the internet archives. And this is maybe something that we should also discuss a little bit in terms of better practices. Is every time you mint a PID, you should probably put a copy of that resource into some internet archive as an additional insurance against the original object disappearing. This applies to web pages and not to digital objects, but streams. So you can get the landing page at least through the internet archive, if not the original object. So there's a lot to discuss, I think, still in harmonizing and improving the way in which we guarantee persistence and resolvability over time.
Yes, thanks, Wim. I recall Tibor's presentation being something around the same lines as you said, Wim, but he brought in the trust aspect, that the handle system has its own trust policy with involved certificates and well-defined architecture. Is that something, Tibor, that we should elaborate on in this context?
Well, probably it's too technical, but the point I wanted to make with this comment is that there are new requirements which somehow will influence the technology, and what Wim was saying about how metadata attributes could be versioned in a PID record or in a normal metadata record or in whatever manner is probably a discussion which will have an influence on the technology used for persistent identifiers, and lots can be learned from other metadata maintenance processes and other metadata maintenance services. And this brings me to the point back that many of the, so it's not a question, but mainly more a comment. Many of these aspects are to be seen in a more broader context, like the sensitive metadata, like the object lifecycle, like the these metadata versioning, and not just as a PID topics. And again, those discussions might be to follow in a broader context, not just narrowed down to the PID stuff.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So in the chat also there is an interest in seeing more from what Wim mentioned around the persistency checks, and Wim said that he would include a link in the chat, I guess, from the project wiki where these are documented. So if you want to learn more about the work that we mentioned, then you can go and have a look there. All right, so in terms of time, we have 4 more minutes to discuss. So this would probably be one of the last chances to bring something to this discussion before we need to end. Are there any more comments or points you want to make before we close? If not, I can just remind you of populating the spreadsheet some more if you haven't already done so, and also having a look at the notes and adding things that might be missing and that you would like to be included in the discussion and probably in the end report as well of the Synchronization Force workshops. And Javier inserted a comment here. I hope Internet Archive survives after the claim made by the publishers, archive.org. Okay, is that something you wanna further elaborate upon, Javier? Sorry, Javier, we can't hear you currently. No, we still can't hear you. There seemed to be a problem with your microphone, I'm afraid. Yes, please send a link and we can have a look at that. Yes, Lisa also pointed out in the chat. So for everyone that presented today, please check your own points to make sure that everything is correctly elaborated upon in the notes as well. Well, I think if there is nothing more, let's just end it like a couple of minutes early. That is perfectly fine. Thank you all very much for presenting and for actively participating in this workshop. Looking forward to the forthcoming workshops. See you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.